Welcome everyone to Amplification 101. Our instructor today will be Justin Weber. He has been a lifelong audiophile,
Yes.
And a major figure in our community. He founded ampsandsound, I believe it was 7 years ago, and has created some of the most loved tube amps in the hi-fi community, including the Kenzie, the Mogwai, the Agartha, and most recently the Nautilus and Red October.
Which you can't run away with. They weigh too much.
Yeah.
I have a Kenzie here if you guys want to pass it around.
So I urge everyone to stay tuned to the very end. We have a surprise planned for you.
Actually, I might start off. Can I get 2 questions that you guys would really like to have answered first, and then we can kind of just go through reading what I prepped and talking about it more expansively. Does anybody have any dying to know questions? Sure.
Which solid state amp do you use?
None. Wait, none. Which do I own?
Sure.
Okay. So and which have I owned? Well, we could back into it 2 different ways. So I always tell people there's an amp from a company called Emotiva. Emotiva is designed here, made in China. They make a $200 or $250 amp. It used to be called the A100. It's a 50-watt Class AB amplifier. It's got a headphone jack in the front, and you can remove 2 jumpers, and it becomes a 50-watt headphone amp. So if you want to own some HE6s or Safaras, it's the best sounding $250 amplifier you're ever going to get, and it comes with a 5-year warranty. So I suggest that. Things I have built or bought recently, I like Parasound. It's a company. They're not a headphone company, but they come with like a 10-year warranty. Parasound is like owning a Honda Civic. It is not fancy, but it's really, really reliable. And they're true to source, so they're not going to color your music. I have a young daughter. I always worry about tubes and her being somewhat careless. So in our family space, I have a Parasound. Which one is it? The JC1. So it's Class AB, 250 watts, paired with a set of my home-built speakers that only need 1 watt. It's completely stupid. But why not? It looks beautiful too. It comes in champagne. It's a great choice. If I was building a Sasfara choice that was solid state, I would go to DIYaudio.com, and they have a Nelson Pass, who's a very famous, super smart designer, way smarter than I, has been doing this for many people's lifetimes, longer than any of us, has what's called the ACA, the Amp Camp Kit, because Pass Labs, so he owns a company called First Watt, which is sort of like his DIY version of building his amplifiers, and then he has Pass Labs, which is like the fancy, pretty casework, very commercial product. And he has this festival every year called Burning Amp, like Burning Man. And he teaches people how to build some of his kits. And so he has a kit called the ACA, which is called the Amp Camp Amp. And in this, they walk people through who have no soldering experience how to build their very first amplifier. And what's interesting about it is that they use like a laptop-based power supply, so there's no voltages that are going to kill you. If you hook it up wrong, you won't break anything other than your ego, right? And lots of people have modded these to run Hi-Fi Man HE6s and Safaras and Amandas and things that, if you're like a planner person, because they're single-ended, zero feedback, Class A amplifiers that produce between 5 and 12 watts. And so if I was going to have a solid-state amp, again, I'd have an Amp Camp amp, because there's pride of ownership. I know how to fix it. And it has been crowdsourced by people infinitely smarter than I who've spent hundreds of hours doing it. So how I came into audio was that I couldn't afford really nice audio equipment. But I grew up with pretty nice audio equipment. My parents had a really nice room. So they had a room that was like a canted ceiling and was really long, and the speakers fired the lengthways into the room and sounded really, really magical. And I always wanted to try to recreate that. And so that's how I started in audio. And I bought used equipment from Craigslist that didn't work right. And then you're left with either turning it into a paperweight or a junk pile, or you learn to fix it. And the internet's great for forums, and a soldering iron and a voltmeter can fix most things. So that's how that process started for me. Okay, so things, tubes versus solid state. I'm a lover of tubes for a few reasons. Old tubes, which don't have to necessarily mean expensive, were made at the time, in all likelihood, that my father was walking around. So the tubes inside the Kenzie, as an example, the power tubes, can be dated back to 1937. And they cost $17 each. So something that sat on a shelf for like 70 years up until the moment I can use it, you know, and I appreciate that sort of history to it, you know, that it's a repurposed tube that was in a radar installation, you know, so that's why I dig sort of the intangible history. As a sort of social commentary, you know, our world is becoming increasingly difficult to understand. The world is smaller and faster and much more difficult to understand. And so there's this idea sociologically called slow technology. So it's like the idea of, why do I have a watch that has a winder in it? Why does my father, I do not understand this. I mean, I can't even fathom why this, truthfully, because I can't spell, but why does my dad use a typewriter, right? Why do we restore old vehicles? Because you can understand how they work. I'm sorry about that. And so tube amps actually give us the ability to reproduce sound, both that sounds really, really good, but that is also truly understandable. I think that as we move closer and closer to digital amplification, our ability to understand that gentlemen, would you guys, if you take this with you, it will serve you a good purpose later.
Much appreciated.
Yeah, of course. If you get into and we'll talk about it in a second, Class D amplification, the algorithm that does the pulse width modulation or the reconstruction filter that's inside a DAC is generally so far beyond our understanding of both how it works and how we can make adjustments to it to get a better outcome, right? Whereas it's really much more tangible and easier to understand that this resistor drops voltage this way, or this resistor sounds different, or this capacitor might sound different than that capacitor. And that ability to make one change and hear a difference, I think lends itself to us having a greater attachment to it. You know, which do you have more attachment to? You know, so lots of engineers have an attachment to a calculator called the RPR, reverse numeric. It's a style of calculation where you put in 2, enter 2, and then you put the function, right? And people will obsess about these old HP calculators that will do this rather than using their phone that will do it for them, or rather than a spreadsheet or whatever. It's because it's an understandable and tangible means when we've moved past our ability to really understand all things. If anybody ever tells you that a tube amp is linear and distortion free, they are likely lying to you. Or they are talking about tube amps within a certain bandwidth being very linear. The claim to fame of what tube amps do is that their style of distortion is more akin to what is reproduced in the natural environment. So a tube amp just sounds more real. And how it as it normally functions, how it produces sound sounds more consistent with how nature produces sound than a solid state amp. So the general question then becomes about solid state amps versus tube amps is, do I value speed and accuracy, or do I value trueness to tone? And that's not generally an oversimplification. I'll give you an example. Like on one hand, really love singer-songwriter stuff. So like anything from Mumford & Sons to like Paul Simon, right? That's sort of like my wheelhouse of favorite kinds of music. But once upon a time, I used to really love EDM, electronic dance music. The tones that are generated by an 808 synthesizer is nowhere ever reproduced in nature, right? You know, that kind of stuff, never reproduced in nature. There's no cricket, frog that makes that sound, right? And so when you look at it like on a scope or on a spectrum analyzer, its acoustic properties are unique and actually very difficult for a tube amp to produce. So there's a thing called a rise time, which is like how fast. So like if you think like a cymbal hit or a thumb snap, how fast that snap happens, tube amps can only do it so fast, right? Their rise time for a given signal is less, almost exponentially less than that can be produced by a solid state amplifier. So if you want things that are very synthesized, R&B, electronic dance music, things like that, and that's your bastion, you might very well want a solid state amp because it's going to have the fast transients that a tube amp will not have. But if you're like, I love guitars, I collect them, I build them, I know the difference between metal strings and nylon strings and strings cut from the gut of a goat. There are people who can argue that they can hear the differences. Or you can hear the differences on whether someone's used a canoid mic or a mic without a spit guard on it. So they can, sometimes when you hear someone either giving a verse and you can hear them spitting into the mic, things like that, or their voice has a unique tremolo, so the vibration within the vocal cord is unique. Tube amps will do that more in a way that feels more true to the actual source. And so you're really just picking a camp of what music do I enjoy that matches with the acoustic properties of the topology that I'm looking for, if that makes sense. The rest is then measurements of how each one compares and contrasts, and we'll get into that in a second. But you're picking a religion, truth be told. And that's okay. And you can also say, hey, I'm an agnostic. People who are agnostics would say, I have tubes on my mid-ranges, and I have solid state on my bass. If they have, you don't do that with headphones, but you do that with speaker systems, right? So people will have their subs or their low-frequency drivers with like these Crown 1,000-watt Crown amps, and then they'll have a 2-watt tube amp on their mid-range, because the mid-range didn't need the same sort of energy and dynamics. In headphones, we don't get to choose like that. You get to pick one or the other. And there's ways to modulate that, whether you choose to maybe have a tube pre or a DAC that has a tube output stage, and then you want a solid state power amp. There's ways to come about it, but you really should try to think about your choices about what do I really enjoy listening to and which one is going to give me closest to that. Because then you're going to find more satisfaction. All right, let's see. I've given some basic information on how tubes work. Electrons flow a certain way. There's a voltage, there's a grid, a cathode, and an anode. It's all here. There's a website that there's a search term you guys could look at. So the last time I gave this class, people said, where do I go for more information? And so I'm going to give you 3 solid choices. You guys are going to have to either write them down or remember them, unfortunately. One is, there's the RCA tube manual. So if you just Google search RCA tube manual or eBay it, it's between like $6 and $12. In audio, specifically tube audio, there is no original idea. Everybody's a plagiarist. And if you are going to plagiarize, you plagiarize from the RCA tube manual. They built the tubes and they tell you what to do with them. Implementation matters though. I mean, if you've ever had a brownie or a really good cake, it's all flowers and eggs, right? How it gets put together matters. But the RCA tube manual lines it up really, really, really well. There's also a book, Beginner's Guide to Reading Schematics, which is a really good book, costs you like $12. But the one that is like the holy grail, free, web-based, if you search the term NEETS, which is, let me go back to my search term, NEETS, right? United States Navy Electrical and Electrons Training Series modules. So if you, United States Navy Electrical and Electricity and Electronics Training Series modules, NEETS, NEETS. They teach you how not to die first, how to read a schematic second, how to diagnose something, and then how to fix it. They do not teach you how to design it. Design is a separate, completely separate animal. But the NEETS modules, I think there are like 30 of them. They're web-based. If you were a Navy corpsman and had like a radar installation or a ham radio that you had to fix, and that was like your job duty, you would have taken this as your specialty training. So it's actually it's a good training. It's free. You guys can do it. Let's see. One of the things to think about regarding tube amps versus solid state amps, and one of the questions people ask me is like, why don't your tube amps have XLR outputs? So an XLR connection, which looks like 3 pins, 3 wires going together in like a barrel connector, right? An XLR connection is supposed to be a balanced connection, which means it's supposed to have 1 ground and 2 hots. The 2 hots are meaning two active signals, and the 2 active signals are supposed to be in a 180-degree phase difference between each other, so that when you tie them back together, they cancel they sum and difference each other out, cancel out the noise. You can have long cable runs and nothing bad happens. You have a pure signal, right? To produce 2 hots, you have to have 2 of everything. So instead of having like one power transformer and 2 output transformers, wherever they have, so instead of having 1 power and 2 output transformers, 1 power tube, 1 power tube, 1 input tube, right? You'd have to have 4, right? Because you're having to generate 4 of everything. Tube amps, almost all tube amps, whether they're what's called a push-pull, a parallel single-ended amp, or a single-ended amp, is a single-ended device. Now, if they give you XLRs, there is a reasonable probability that they are doing it in what's called a convenience manner, meaning that it is not really a true balanced connection. It is to allow you to use the cabling of your choice, but the performance is the same. In other words, it's kind of like false advertising, right? Now, on some of my amps, we have XLR input, and you're like, well, Justin, are you lying there? Well, we use XLR input. We have transformers that do the conversion for us. So there are actual special transformers that can take the 2 hot signals and sum and difference it to make 1 hot signal, and they get put in the amp. If they're not there on my amp, then I don't have those transformers. So I try to stay true to that idea. Solid state devices generally have the ability to be almost twice as powerful in a balanced configuration. It's a heck of a lot easier to have 4 little MOSFETs or JFETs. A MOSFET might look the size of my thumbnail, and a JFET is like the size of the tip of your pinky. Having an extra 2 of those to make it balanced is pretty easy. Having an extra 2 of these output transformers is much more difficult, right? From a space standpoint, right? Imagine packing double these, right? So you can create double the power. The question is if you need it. So solid state devices tend to be simpler, less component, generally pack in less components, thank goodness, have less thermal concerns. They don't get as hot. If anybody saw me, I did a tube swap while my tubes were hot, and I was trying to remove my fingerprints so I could be a cat burglar. They're calloused at this point. They don't do that anymore, but I still shouldn't have done it. Tubes get really, really, really hot because the whole idea is that they heat up a filament inside these tubes to the point that then the plates start emitting electrons. It's hot. It's like grabbing an incandescent bulb. Only silly people do that, right? So don't do that, by the way. So solid state amps can pack a lot more things that make them more effective in a smaller space. But they also generally have much narrower operating parameters. So solid state amps don't like to be pushed outside of their designed limitations. So if you ever see a solid state amp that says like, don't hook up an HE6 to this, because you're going to see a puff of smoke and it's going to get cooked, right? Because an HE6 is so demanding, sometimes its impedance that it demands of the amplifier will drop really low, very close to ground. And if it goes to ground, you'll short it out and bad things happen. HE6 is like a speaker practically, right? So a solid state amp has to be designed to be used within a much narrower operating parameters, where tube amps in general, because of these transformers, are really resistant to that, and you can almost throw anything at it and they don't care. They may not always sound great, but they don't care what they see. So it's a different way of looking at how you build things. Are you wanting compactness? Are you wanting energy efficient? By the way, these are not energy efficient at all. They're about as efficient as a blender, running all the time.
So you shouldn't leave it on overnight?
So there's two schools of thought about tube amps. The turning it on and off, you burn up the plating of the cathode, and eventually you burn up your tube by turning it on and off. And there are people who will swear, my Macintosh amp, I've never turned it off in 15 years, and look, the tubes still run. I have cats and a dog and a small child. I was a Boy Scout. Didn't become a Eagle Scout, but you don't leave hot things that are potential fire hazards, unattended. That's why you also don't leave your door open to the ocean. It invites bad things to happen. I don't believe in doing it, to be honest with you. And I own a lot of tube gear. I've never had a tube, and no piece of my tube gear has ever failed in a way that would have caused a fire hazard. I still don't do it. It worries me because fires are really hard to fix. So I wouldn't do it. And the amp may not fail, but the tube might fail. Then what do we do? But a well-built amplifier, whether it be tube or solid state, should have safety mechanisms built into it, like fuses. So that if there was a cascading failure, the fuse should go out, which kills the power. But it wouldn't have a failure point if a scarf fell on top of it and caught on fire. The amp would be operating perfectly fine while the flame was doing its thing. It's a hard one. I mean, some of the tubes that I like to use actually take like 3 hours before they get hot enough to sound really great. And that's a big buy-in, right? So one of the tubes that a lot of people who have owned my amps or know about is this one called a Bendix 6384. It's a fairly popular tube. It's like so there's a tube called a 6L6 GC. It's like the world's most popular tube ever made. It was made famous by all these recording studios. It's the quintessential American sound tube, right? And the 6384 is compatible with it. The 6384 was made by Bendix to be used in intercontinental ballistic missiles to power the gyro mechanism that steered the missile. So you can drop it, dunk it, break it in half, and that shit will still run. It's like the Energizer Bunny did something special to it. But because it has titanium parts inside and the spacers inside the tube, instead of being like little glass spacers like this is, are ceramic, it takes like 3 hours to get hot enough. So it doesn't really, it sounds dull until you've given it 3 hours to get warm enough. It's like, who's gonna buy into that unless you leave it on all night? So I get that point. So regarding construction, in general, solid state amps use low voltage as a general rule. So they're like under 16 volts, you know, maybe 20 volts plus or minus. They're creating, you know, two voltage legs that are like less than 20 volts. Most good tube amps are operating above 400 volts. So one should be more careful with them. I have an amp called the Mogwai. Does anybody here a Gremlins fan? Right? So Mogwais are super cute until you get them wet. Much like a tube amp. Never get a tube amp wet. It's a bad idea. It goes so poorly. So that's kind of the same idea. That's why I came up with the name.
Question is a solid state better for that?
Getting wet.
In all honesty, probably, because like a solid state component, so there's lots of different ways to build things, but a lot of solid state equipment has what's called surface mount electronics. So they take like a resistor. The resistor is going to look like a grain of rice, like on our phones. If you ever open the back of the phones, right? And so they're wave soldered. So they're basically like, they use a little piece of glue and they glue everything in place, and then they dip it in a bath, and the bath actually solders the joints. And then very often, because of corrosion questions, then they will put like Scotch-Brite, if an effective version of like Scotch-Brite over all the components. So because the EU, because of environmental regulations, doesn't like solder that has lead in it. Lead is a fantastic, durable component. Like a solder joint that has lead in it will never really go bad. But you can't use it anymore. I mean, like I still use it. It's still like Cardis sells me the solder that I use. You can still get it, but in mass-produced electronics, it's an absolute impossibility. And so it has a higher degree of tin in it, and it is more, because of those concerns about corrosion and lack of lead, they use annealing, gluing agents, and so they will, in all likelihood, have like taken hairspray to the top of the PCB and sealed it. So if you get it wet, the probability of you actually having fluid puncture into the seal, into the hermetic seal, and touch your solder joint is pretty small. Where on my tube amp, no, sure as shit, you're going to do something bad if you drop something on it. So that's just and solid state equipment. And I will tell you, I have a, so I hate to fly. Here's a truth about me. I hate to fly. I'm a social worker. I'm a trained therapist. I help people through very difficult situations. I cannot help myself with my own flight issues, so I use pharmacology. You know, I've had people pray for me on planes, right? I have that same pathological issue with wall warts. I cannot own a piece of equipment that's got a wall wart. I just can't do it. I could tell you all sorts of things that I would rather do to myself than use a piece of equipment that had a wall wart. I had a Rega P3 turntable. I had a wall wart. I bought a VPI as a result. Couldn't do it. Just could not do it. And it's a better table, but that side, I adversely hate wall warts. And that's okay. Solid state equipment is getting to a place where they design the equipment to be very quiet and compact and perform really, really well, and they tend to outsource the power supply development, either to a wall wart or to a switched mode power supply. And that's okay. It meets a different set of design criteria. That said, your ability to service a power supply when you encounter a failure is pretty small. So if you've ever had a wall wart or a laptop power supply go bad on you, you don't fix them, right? You ever had a laptop power supply go bad? Did you fix it?
We got a new one.
There we go. Right. Whereas, and that's either because they're using inexpensive, off-the-shelf, $3 wall warts, right? Or they're using switched mode power supplies that have this like white putty on it that's a thermal paste that you would have to replace remove the thermal paste, desolder the bad component, put the good component back on, and replace the thermal paste, and the probability of you doing that is like, right? Whereas, as a different manufacturing idea, we use linear power supplies, which means we have big transformers with big capacitors. And if there's a failure, I think I've built less than 500 amps, more than 300. I've had two power transformer failures in all that time. We source our power transformers to have a 200% overload. So anything that we ask it to do, it can do double if we needed it to. Now, we've had failures, but the failures have been a $3 capacitor, not a power transformer. And the serviceability is that you replace the capacitor. In that, though, you have weight, right? You have heat, you have power consumption questions, and you have to decide where you want to be on it. Again, solid-state devices are more linear, they're more predictable, they are, on paper, better performing. They're smaller, they're more economical typically too. The question you ask yourself, though, is, does it sound the way I wish it to? And for some people it will. If you like electronic dance music, right, you should be using a solid-state amp, truth be told. Because it will do what you want it to do. It will have enough bass grip and speed that it will grab you differently. Yeah?
It depends on the headphone. My HD100S sounds way better on tubes for EDM than a solid state.
Okay. Well, and that may be a question though, so depending on the tube amp you're using, one of the questions we have here is dampening factor. Now, I used to build tube amps that were intended for high efficiency speakers. That market sort of dried up, it became passe, and everybody said, oh, I should build for headphones instead, which is kind of what I did, right? Because a high efficiency speaker has about the same sensitivity as a moderately efficient headphone. So the same sort of noise floor characteristics and that kind of stuff, right? Triodes with high primary impedances, which is how I do things, generally have really low dampening factor. Now, headphones have their own implicit suspensions that are either very rigid or aren't, and so having a low dampening factor can actually give your headphone more voluminous bass, but not have it be as taut. And so if you have multiple impedances, people will then say, well, then if I go down in impedance, my current will go up, which tends to be true, and in all probability, your dampening also goes up slightly. So your bass is less voluminous, but tighter in its articulation. Again, sort of you gotta try it and see if you like it question. But I hope you guys hear when I'm saying this, you're just sort of thinking about theologically what would make the most sense for me and why, right? That's what I'm hoping you guys are getting from things. Before I move on, any questions I can answer for you guys? Sure, you have a hand up, go.
Are we gonna get to tube rolling later?
We can get to, yes, we'll get to tube rolling later.
Okay, I was hoping that was gonna be a topic.
Sure, we can get to tube rolling.
So you mentioned you just decided to go and try those. Is there any reason why you picked that over something like OTL or other types of technology?
Yes, and yes. I'm filtering. I'm trained to tell. I'm very good at telling when people lie. You can't pull truth. You can't tell when people tell you truths, but you can always tell when people are filtering. Filtering is always lies. No, it's true. If someone's thinking they're filtering, if they're filtering, they're lying. They're not including all information to you. So I'm thinking about how to say this diplomatically.
You don't have to. I mean,
No, I do actually. Okay. So OTL amps, from my perspective, which is only as one manufacturer that doesn't produce them, and yet I am representing a company that does that I greatly admire. So let's put all things in context, okay? But OTL topologies are very, very fast. They have great air and extension, but they have very little weight behind it. So if you're a car guy, it's like having a lot of horsepower and no torque. You know, you can get there, but you can't stay there. Right? I don't, and they are very, very impedance dependent. So if you push them like a solid state amp outside of their operating parameters, they're very unhappy. You know, so one of the things, so we're going to be doing some raffles at the end of this, and one of the companies that I want to espouse the importance of is Bottlehead, which hopefully you see Doc Bottlehead's logo here. They were kind enough to extend something for me to give, 3 things for me to give away to you guys. One of which is a Bottlehead crack. If you are, so the 2 companies that I'm here to espouse that are not me, because I'm not trying to make this a me show at all, is Shit. Now, the Shit Magni, which I will also be giving away, is a completely discrete amplifier. Every part on that can be repaired, comes with a warranty. It's small, it represents exactly what I said, right? It's got good thermal characteristics. Its manufacturing is compact in size. It's actually all discrete. There's no microprocessor on it, thank God. I don't believe in microprocessors, by the way, with mini computers. I don't believe mini computers and audio equipment in general should be part of each other. That's why we call it analog. But this is a really good example. Now, the one thing they do that I don't really love is that they use a wall wart. If you move up their line, they stop doing that, right? But if you're talking about as an entry point, this and a HD 600 is stupid good, like magically stupid good. Or a Hi-Fi Man, the Hi-Fi Man Sundara is a stupidly good choice with this. And one should be very, very pleased to use it. So this is one full-on topology, right? Okay. Another choice, back to your point about OTL amps, is the Shit crack, right? Bottlehead crack, I'm sorry, yeah, you're right, Bottlehead crack. They did not include the speedball option. Now you have to, if you guys remember New York or Los Angeles and the whole crack epidemic, it's kind of funny because there's a speedball and a crack. You know, y'all can draw whatever conclusions you wish about that. But this is an OTL amplifier that sounds amazing and is a wonderfully good choice and will help you understand what you're listening to and what design decisions made into it. Linear power supply, but no output transformer, right? But used outside of a 300 ohm impedance, it's an unhappy choice. So if you have like anything from ZMF, anything from Sennheiser, this is magic, right? This is good value, super magical, well worth doing. But I would still say I like transformers because transformers are like torque converters. They transfer power to a usable, they convert power into a usable resource. And the absence of it, though has speed, probably lacks texture as compared to a similar pairing of an amplifier that would have an output transformer. And so then you start kind of getting this, like, I like tubes more than solid state, Justin, cool. I want them fast and light, then OTLs might be your answer, which would be like LTA or Bottlehead. But if you're like, no, I want that meaty texture. Now, truthfully, meaty texture is an American sound signature from my perspective. If you look at like mastering techniques, a bump in your mid-range is an American sonic preference. It is not a world sonic preference. But most of us like it. right? And transformer coupled amplifiers, capacitor coupled transformer output based amplifiers have that in spades. And so I like it, and it's, you know, a good example of, like, if you wanted to say, what does an OTL amp sound like? Or what does a solid state amp sound like, Justin? I would say it sounds like a mastering mix. There's no spin on the ball. There's no accentuation of the lower mids, and the high frequency is unattenuated. So there's going to be a lot of information up high that you may or may not want to know about, right? You say an OTL amp, you're going to say that it has really fast transients. It gives that tonal balance is really true, but it sounds like it's distant. It doesn't have the texture and weight that you might want. Where if you looked at a transformer-based amp, more conventional kind of amplifier, and we can ask, there's a few people in the room that can tell you this is a decidedly conventional amplifier from its design standpoint. It's got a linear power supply, it's got two output transformers and two output tubes. It's about as nuts and bolts as it gets from a design standpoint. Has a thick mid-range. Now, because, and we'll get into these other topics in a minute, you know, Class A, Class B, Class AB, Class D, and feedback. Feedback is another word for beige. Feedback is another word for homogenization. So if we took like a bell curve and you clip the ends off of it, that's feedback. It makes everything better behaved, but I think you lose important information that you may value as a result, right? So if you've ever had a spaghetti sauce that didn't add sugar, right? You may not love it, but you will say that it's got a bit more taste profile extremes in it, right? That you can taste the fats differently, right? Things like that. And I think that like feedback is that same sort of question, right? And again, I'm helping you pick religions. All right, so regarding Class A, Class B, AB, and Class D, hold on just a second if you don't mind. Class A, it's always running. It's doing the full sine wave. Class AB, it's switching. It's sort of what we'd call a push-pull configuration. In headphone amps, you're unlikely to encounter a Class AB amplifier. You shouldn't, at least in all likelihood, unless it's putting out a lot of power. Class D or Class T, I'm a fan of Class T amplifiers, which I think Herb would tell us is probably still considered a Class D amplifier. But a Class T amplifier is a single chip solution. Some of the best sounding amplifiers I have ever heard were made by Jeff Rowland, and they took this one chip made by TI called the 1875 or the 1836, otherwise known as the gain clone. And they put them all together and paralleled them, and Jeff Rowland sold lots of these very expensive amplifiers with this single TI chip that did everything. So the single chip didn't need anything else in front of it. It needed like two capacitors and two resistors in front of it. And Jeff Rowland, this famous designer, took like 50 of them, put them in a box, and Wim Bam Boom charged like $20,000 for it, and it sounded magical. So I think Class T amplifiers are super awesome. If you're going to be a hobbyist, go on eBay. There are Class T gain clone boards that you can buy. You can buy a really good amplifier. They'll produce between 18 to 50 watts very easily. 1875 or 3686 chip. Class D is a different animal. It's a digital, and I'll come to your question. Is a different animal. It uses a fundamentally different process on how amplification works. It is its own complete discussion. The people that are smartest about it write algorithms to do it. It has a level of complexity that really is an entire semester's course taught by mathematicians. They're very compact. They can be extraordinarily powerful. And oh, by the way, you will never fix one. They do not get fixed. They don't get fixed. Ever. They're not. With rare exception, a Class D amplifier is a fixable product. So, what was your question, sir?
I was wondering if there were considerations you made for, or maybe just a separate tube amp that works well with planers.
I would argue that many of my amps are most, with the exclusion of like the Kenzies or whatnot, are way overpowered for headphones as they are, and even though tubes are generally voltage amplifying devices, because they are so overpowered, they're able to handle planners well. Because I underreport how much they put. I don't tell people everything that these amplifiers are capable of, because I'd like to see them keep their eardrums. They're not replaceable parts yet. You're unlikely to blow the diaphragm on your driver before you blow the diaphragm in your ear. Most planners, it depends on the planner that we're talking about. But if your question is like, hey Justin, do you make an amp that plays a Sesfara? Yes, I do. Go listen to it. But 2 to 3 years ago, there was this paradigm that headphones were becoming less efficient and amps were becoming more efficient. And then in the last 2 years or so, headphones became really efficient and amps sort of stayed where they were or had to drop in efficiency to try to chase a lower noise floor because the headphones had become too efficient. And now in this sort of new product cycle, from my perspective, you have the return of the flagship planners that really just want, almost like they're field coil speakers, they want as much darn power as you can throw at them. What was the question, or time?
10 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Cool. My bad. Questions, and then we can. We're going to do questions. And who's got number 16? Come on down. You are the next contestant on The Price is Right. Showcase Showdown. Courtesy of shit. They hope you enjoy it.
Thank you.
All right. Do we have number 47? Here you go, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bobblehead hat.
Anybody have 8?
Oh.
All right.
Do not burn your, you will burn your fingers. It's expected. This is a bottlehead crack. Enjoy. Thank you. That's courtesy of Bottlehead. Doc Bottlehead and his wife couldn't make it, but they wanted to make sure that you guys had an opportunity. If you're asking my 2 cents though, don't include the speedball option. Here's why. The speedball option uses JFETs to make the signal a little bit more homogenized. Keep it a true tube amp, you're going to like it more. It will be less well behaved, but it will sound better. All right, questions?
We have time for a few questions.
Yeah.
Can you speak about the first watt principle and why certain lower powered amps can drive extremely hard to drive headphones like this? Like the Formula S has a pretty modest power output, but it just kills that thing.
Sure. I mean, what Nelson Pass, plagiarizing, would tell you is it's the first watt that matters. It's the first watt that matters the most. And I think that that's true. The probability that you're pushing past 1 watt of use of energy for a sustained period of time is actually pretty small. And if the first watt is actually a good first watt, it means that your power supply and your input stage are both well designed, and that your power supply is both rigid and your input stage is robust. And so I think that the first watt tells how the second watt will be, but the probability of you pushing past that first watt is unlikely, truth be told. Dynamic headroom and all. I mean, no one is garnering. It's like the question of a room and speakers. The moment you can actually feel the music on your wall, you've already pushed past your room and you're just being an asshole. No, because your room can only tolerate so much acoustic energy. And the moment your drywall is talking, your drywall is now turned into a speaker. It was never intended as a speaker, and it sounds terrible.
So does it mostly apply to speaker?
I'm sorry?
Does it mostly apply to power amps, or is it also for headphone amps?
Well, headphone amps are power amps. And so what I'm saying though is like, so if your question is like, what energy can my ear canal and the surrounding tissue absorb? Truthfully, it absorbs a great deal of energy. What amount of energy can you tolerate versus power output is one, an interpersonal question, but I would still argue that it is unlikely that you're pushing past the amp at really being at idle. Most amps are playing music at a level that is consistent with them idling, not really at them at full power. What was your tube rolling question, sir?
Yeah, and nothing specific, but as someone that's getting into tube rolling, it can be
Can I give you a suggestion?
daunting, I would say, because there's so many options out there.
Can I give you a suggestion?
So yeah,
Let's assume your budget's $600. Don't buy on eBay unless you want to be lied to and throw money away. No, for real. Don't buy on eBay unless you are prepared to just be lied to by blanket statements. Here's the why. And if you have $600, buy a good tube tester, do some basic reading on how to get it calibrated, and then start testing your tubes before you start buying NOS tubes. So a tube, and Herb might tell it better than us, but a tube has sort of three measurements. It brand new, it should be thrown away, and sort of the number that they tell us. Almost always on eBay they say this is the minimum, and here's your score. But they don't tell you what it is brand new. So like you can buy an NOS GZ34 rectifier, a very popular rectifier, and they say, oh, it has a score of 80. Minimum is 40. Throw it away at 40, right? They're like, oh, it's double minimum. It's a good tube. Let's go. It's 150 brand new. The score for on the tester that I would use is 150. So they're telling you that it scored 80. It's not brand new. But they're charging you pretend brand new money. And then there are things that they can do. They can take the line voltage of the tube tester and bump up the line voltage past 120, and it'll goose the tube results. Unless you own a tester, don't buy it from non-accredited vendors. Brent Jesse, great vendor to buy from. Tube Depot, great vendor to buy from. Truly, you'll get NOS what you're paying for, right? Tubes and More, great vendor to buy from. But Joe Schmo saying that these are unused tubes. Look, the box looks brand new. Box can look brand new. That doesn't mean that tube is. So unless you have a tester, and before you go buy NOS tubes, buy a tester. You'll be happy you do, because you will catch people lying, and eBay has a great return policy. You catch them lying, you can return it then. That's my 2 cents. Hi.
Hi. I have a question that goes with yours here, and I don't know the answer. It's not a rhetorical question, and it's about tube rolling. I was just reviewing the preamp, solid state preamp, and a tube preamp, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, is this tube preamp, which I've had for a while, it's sounding dull. Mm-hmm. Now, I measured the tubes on a tube tester, and they look great. But I've had them a few years, and it's almost like a moral dilemma. The tube tests well. It's a modern tube, contemporary manufacturer, but it's sounding dull. So I'm asking myself existentially, like, is it fair that I'm reviewing this and saying this amp sounds dull when it could be the tubes? And I don't know the answer to that, but if you're potential tube rollers, which I've been doing this a long time, what I've learned, and it's really funny, but the difference, as far as I know, and I could be wrong, back when RCA or GE or Western Electric or anybody was making tubes, like RCA in Camden, New Jersey, they'd make 1,000 tubes, and all of them would go through this same regimen of testing, and they would get these curves that showed the characteristic of the tube. And in the center of the curve, they would cut out, and they had all these numbers. They would take, don't laugh, 62% of the tubes right out of the center of the curve and put those in boxes and sell them. The other, what is it, 27%? They threw in the landfill in Camden, New Jersey. As far as I know, people have dug up that landfill looking for those tubes. And as far as I can tell by asking people, and nobody gives me a straight answer, contemporary tubes are not throwing any tubes in the landfill.
Well, so what I,
You know what I'm saying?
by the way, everybody, this is Herb Reichert, which is of Stereophile and
Sound printers.
one of the smartest people, the smartest person in the room about this.
No, absolutely. I mean, even listening to you, I'm like, wow, this guy knows what he's talking about.
But what I would say, like, here's things that they don't tell you about new tubes. They measure really well at first, and then their measurements drop really fast. So like an old tube will stay a viable, good tube for years and years and years and years.
Indefinitely, possibly.
Right, like Timex watches used to be, you know. New tubes, that is not a truthful statement. New tubes, within 10 hours, 100 hours, 200 hours, you will see significant percentage changes that you wouldn't have experienced with an NOS tube. That's a pickle. About Herb's question.
Yeah, my question is, how do you know if a new tube that tests well, if
I would
you
roll
want
it.
to change it? I don't know the answer.
I would roll in a different one or the exact same tube, brand new, and see if I heard a difference. You know, I mean, here's the thing about choosing tubes is embracing the organic and the humanity of things. Ultimately, no test bench is going to answer whether you love it or not. Your ears are. And let your ears be the guide. Now, for when you don't have a great experience base or you don't have a lot of money, that's a bitch, right? Because you're counting on this resource that you haven't trained yet. And that's a problem, and I can respect that as a problem, right? At which point, buying from like reputable tube vendors becomes more important. Like I'll give you the best steal of a tube you should purchase at this moment. So if you guys like 12AX7 tubes, which almost everybody has one, right, or would use one potentially, if you buy a Muller 12AX7 from Tube Depot, made in Britain, it's a $250 tube, having never actually been used by anybody else. If you buy an NOS one, made in Britain 12AX7 from eBay, it's been used by 10 other people, and they're lying to you, first of all, right? But you can buy a Mashashita 12AX7 from Tube Depot, which was Mullard's tooling that got sold to Japan for $49 right now, having never been used. So if you need a 12AX7, you should go buy as many of these $49 tubes as you can, because they're essentially Mullard 12AX7s. Now, Herb will tell you, if you ask him in a different conversation, what is a Yugoslavian EI 12AX7 sound different than a Muller 12AX7, different than a Sylvania 12AX7, different than an RCA 12AX7, different than a Mazda 12AX7? Or did we go short plate, long plate, black plate? There are entire discussions about how each of these sound, but none of them matter other than to your ear.
Is the matched tubes a scam?
Depends on if you need a circuit that's matched.
Okay.
Now, so if you're asking, like, do I need matched triodes?
You have to pay extra. It seems like you usually have to pay extra for that, right?
Yes. You pay extra for matched, you pay extra for low noise, you pay extra for low microphonics.
I'm wondering if those are worth it or not.
9-pin tubes tend to not be microphonic unless you're talking about a 6DJ8. By the way, I'm a biased SOB. Don't get a pre with a 6DJ8. It's a terrible tube. Everybody loves it, but I don't like it. Blame me. 6922 6DJ8 is not a great tube in my opinion. Now, Dan Modwright, famous tube designer, will tell you otherwise. He loves that tube. Okay. But 9-pin tubes, the smaller ones, tend to be less microphonic. Bigger tubes, 6SN7s, 6SL7s, have bigger structures, more glass. They're more prone to microphonics. So you might think about it for that. The bigger the tube, the more likely microphonics. If it's in a preamp, you're probably going to want it to be as quiet as you can be. Paying the extra $4 isn't such a big deal, right? But if it's in a power amp, it probably doesn't matter. And unless you're using both triodes independently, you probably don't need to match triodes. Would you agree, Herb, or do you have any thoughts different?
I wish I could say I knew these things. Right now, and I'm thinking as you're speaking, okay, here's all, I don't have full knowledge, but here's a whole bunch of, new old stock tubes, and here's a bunch of new tubes. Obviously some of the ones like a smooth plate Telefunken or something, even when they're old and used, they're gonna kind of deliver that smooth plate Telefunken thing. After that, it's like the ninth race at the racetrack, anything could happen. You can't predict. And this is a dilemma for me even. It's like, I reviewed just recently, this is a perfect example, I reviewed the Rivera Levant amplifier.
Beautifully made piece of equipment.
It might be the best machine work I've ever seen on an amplifier at any price, anywhere. And it came mistakenly with two sets of tubes. And I'm unpacking it, it's beautifully packed in. I'm going, they sent me extra tubes. And then I said, well, maybe not. So I opened up the box. No, they sent extra tubes, but they were different brands. So I looked, and there were Muller tubes in there, and you'd know more about this. I didn't quite understand it, and they were in a Muller box. And when people say, like when New Sensor or somebody is selling you a Muller or a Gold Line, they basically bought the logo and the artwork that they could put
99% of all tubes are made by New Sensor. New Sensor is like saying Reebok and Nike are two different, imagine Reebok and Nike were the same brand.
Right. Anyhow, so I listened to this amp and I'm like, oh my God, this sounds really good. And then I said, okay, so I'll try the other tubes. And I put in the other tubes, I can't remember what they were, and you can't generalize anyhow, but I put them in and they were really like screechy. I mean, that's an accurate descriptor. And they would shout at you. They would throw a piece of glare at you right in the middle of a piece of music. And we're like, oh. And so I put the Mullers back. And then John Atkinson measured the amplifier. I said, John, these two tubes sound really different. You gotta measure it with both tubes. I wanna see if you can measure this amp and it'll measure differently with this new old stock. And I didn't know it was a new old stock with these two brands of contemporary tubes. And, he usually gets back to me, he said, no, there's no difference in the measurement. Maybe there was a little something. But, turns out that Muller box, which looked just like a new box or an old box, it was hard to say. This was a new old stock Muller. And it sounded unbelievably glorious. And I believe the other one was a JJ, but I wouldn't generalize. Sometimes JJ makes, but the only thing I know is it really is a crapshoot sometimes. And number two, like my first question, I cannot predict anything from a tester. Or how much transconductance or whatever. I bought a tube, a Western Electric 300A tube. Actually, it was a giveaway, it was free because it tested dead. This would have been 92. And they were beautiful, they were engraved, they got the Western logo and all that. And so at one point, I just gave them away as a gift to a friend. And he took those tubes and he put them in his amp. That was 93, maybe 94. He still has them in his amp. They tested dead. I mean, they tested way into this, this is not a good tube.
So, long and short, empiricism only gets you so far.
Yeah. I hate to cut it off. We're about 10 minutes over at this point.
Sorry.
So we're going to have to take the conversation to the hallway so we can get our next setup.
I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope I answered some questions or gave a foundational thinking on things. Thanks, guys. And thank you, Herb, for coming.
I basically spaced out talking to a guy about musicians.